junior at Liberty University. Today my paper is going to be on the disease that drove the manslaughter of over 11 million people, historical research on the impact that typhus had on the Holocaust. Whether it be Voyage to the New World or the American Revolution, history is coupled and influenced by the impact of disease and the ramifications of advancements in medicine. The Holocaust and subsequent history leading up to it are no different. While over 11 million Jews, Slavs, political offenders, and others were massacred at the hands of the Nazis in just over 2 years, typhus, or Fleckfieber as it was commonly known in German, was in the background contributing to the horror. Nazis used the disease to leverage distaste for Jews, create control measures that covered up the gassing of over 1 million people at Auschwitz alone, and to infect prisoners to try out radical treatments and watch the progression of the disease. Typhus is caused by Rickettsia prowazeka, which is an intracellular gram-negative coccobacillus. The disease is transmitted by unaffected lice consuming the blood of a host human that is already infected with the disease already. As lice are difficult to control, they multiply and spread quickly from human to human and carry the rickettsia with them. Common initial symptoms can range from high fevers and headaches to extreme muscular pain and fatigue. After the initial onset, dark spots begin on the trunk of the body and spread to everywhere but the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. If not treated quickly, the disease progresses to shock and low blood pressure in a matter of 1 to 2 weeks and has a mortality rate of 40%. While it is hard to isolate when typhus first became an issue, some of the early evidence suggests that the disease was prevalent even back in Athens during the time of Thucydides, who was an Athenian historian and general around 400 BC. More concrete evidence points to the disease being discovered by a Florentine physician named Francesco in 1546. Once the disease was identified, physicians could make distinctions from other common diseases of the time and start to find treatments, precautionary measures, and better ways to recognize the disease. Physicians and other healthcare professionals characterized it by its rapid progression and rash that was unique from other rashes, which allowed for control measures to begin to be put into place and aided in the development of a vaccine. The vaccine was used as a preventative measure, and it would come about in 1915 by H. Plots. Despite the early 19th century advancements, the disease was not eradicated, and its prevalence throughout ghettos, concentration camps, and death camps would claim the lives of many prisoners and officers. Leading up to the mass killings in the Holocaust, there were many psychological factors put into place to convince the Germans that any person not Aryan was an inferior race and that they should be separated and eventually killed. As typhus was common in Central Asia, the Nazis used propaganda to engender the idea that Jews and Gypsies, who originated in Central Asia, caused the outbreaks of the virulent disease in Eastern Europe. One particular poster, publicized in Poland, read, "Jews are lice, they cause typhus," and another poster in Poland translated to, "Conservation of typhoid, avoid Jews." As Poles, French, Roma, and Netherlanders began to believe what they were hearing and reading, the Nazi Party founded a National Hygiene Committee in 1933, shortly after Adolf Hitler came into power, and they began working on creating efficient measures of containing lice. What seemed safest for the general public became what killed and erased the evidence of over 6,000 Jews, homosexuals, Slavs, and political offenders a day at Auschwitz alone, from September 1941 to its liberation by the Soviet troops in January of 1945. The delousing showers were sometimes a harmless control method, but more often than not, they were used as gas chambers to mass eliminate those who were polluting a population with typhus. After their killing, prisoners would be burned to make sure that the disease was fully controlled. Not only were the Eastern Europeans fooled, the measures took to control typhus were at least initially believed by those around the world looking in on what Germany was doing, as it was best for the safety of many. The idea that Jews were defective and a threat to the public led to the eventual creation of ghettos, which were used to isolate Jews from the rest of the public. The first ghetto was actually created in 1516 to quarter off Jews in Venice, Italy. However, the first ghetto, established under the Nazi regime for Jews, was created in 1939 in Poland. In these ghettos, Jews lived in cramped quarters with lack of medical treatments available. Even inside the ghettos, prisoners were locked in their apartments or sometimes in telephone booths to try and prevent the disease inside the ghetto, and especially to Germans working on the inside of the camp and those living right outside of it. At the Law of Ghetto in Poland, scientist and Dr. Lucia Frey-Gotzman gave evidence of physicians treating typhus and detailed it in her personal journal with the disease as a healthcare provider and a Jew living inside the wretched conditions of the ghetto. Gotzman was part of an elite group of prisoners who had a chance at survival because of the skills they could provide. She describes how typhus was spread to German personnel who worked with the Jews, and how that fed into the idea that it was a Jewish problem. The popular practice in the Law of Ghetto was to march the prisoners outside the ghetto and into a large shower and bathing area in the public, to humiliate and draw attention to them. This furthered the idea of non-Aryans being filthy, diseased animals. Similar situations occurred in other ghettos, like the collection of ghettos in concentration camps in Soviet state. Erna Rubin is a Holocaust survivor who contracted typhus while in the ghettos of Soviet state. She talks about how she was weak and had little energy, but due to safety, she had to walk kilometers upon kilometers a day and sleep on the cold ground in Russian winters, which can be brutal. Erna is one of the few survivors of typhus, but it was years before she fully recovered from the disease. In another ghetto located in Poland, there were advancements being made that were revolutionizing how typhus was diagnosed and treated. While European scientists like Dr. Rudolf Weigel created important vaccines in the mid-1930s to aid in the prevention of typhus, those living inside the ghetto were not fortunate enough to have those medications. Dr. Fleck, however, a graduate of Lau University and a ghetto inmate, transformed the way typhus was treated in the concentration camps. Dr. Fleck began to use a urine antigen test in the early months of 1942 that allowed for physicians without access to a laboratory to be able to test patients for typhus in a very simple way. It was an easy-to-use strip, and physicians only needed a couple drops of urine to run the test, and within seconds the results would come back. His work was published in the Jewish Gazette on May 27, 1941. This discovery allowed for Fleck to identify the antigen causing typhus and develop a vaccine from local materials that would effectively prevent people from contracting the disease. Shortly after his discovery, he was sent to Buchenwald, a concentration camp, where he worked on a serology team to continue his work on typhus. Fortunately, the Americans liberated the camp on April 11, 1945, and shortly thereafter, Fleck returned to Poland to continue researching and publishing his findings. Despite what seemed to be harsh conditions in the ghetto, it was nothing compared to the way that prisoners experienced typhus in the concentration and death camps. Jews, homosexuals, Poles, and Romas arrived from surrounding countries and were dropped off one at a time at the concentration or death camps, including but not limited to Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau. In addition, many foreigners had never been exposed to the disease, and unfortunately that meant it was even easier to become infected. The long train ride in colder temperatures where the disease flourishes meant living in close quarters without bathing for multiple days in a row. The disease ran rampant on these trains, and the lack of proper nutrition, appropriate clothing, and overall sanitation meant recovering from typhus was very difficult, and the mortality rate for it was very high. Once arriving on these horrendous trains, it was certain that prisoners would either be deloused or gassed. After a quick judgment, those who were strong enough to work long and harsh hours for days on end would be forced to remove all clothes and shower with harsh soap and freezing water. They were then given clean clothes, generally striped pajamas, that were often not the right size, and shoes that were ratty and too small or too big. Some healthy prisoners were chosen specifically for medical testing, that was horrific and barbaric, but did sometimes offer better sleeping arrangements, like being given a blanket, extra rations of food, and an extra pair of clothes to stay warm in the freezing temperatures of winter in Eastern Europe. Compared to the experience and horror that other prisoners went through, the extra measures of living seemed appealing. In light of the popularity of typhus in Europe at the time, Nazi doctors and scientists spent time infecting prisoners with the disease and watching it progress. Radical medications and treatments were tested on the patients, and oftentimes the patients died of complications of the disease. After they passed, they were inhumanely dissected to view bodily effects of the disease. Less than 10% of those who survived were subject to invasive testing of everything from hourly blood tests to other injections and new illnesses like smallpox, yellow fever, malaria, and other dangerous and lethal diseases. Other control measures in the concentration and death camps were less invasive and included dropping Zyklon B in canisters into barracks to try and kill the lice, and even using an early modern microwave with high frequencies to kill the lice on clothing and shoes. Since typhus is carried by a pest, pesticides like DDT were used to control the spread of the disease. However, the Nazis were looking for a foolproof plan to eliminate the lice and turned to Zyklon B to help. Zyklon B was the same chemical that was used to exterminate mass numbers of prisoners in the gas chambers. Another common pesticide was prussic acid, which is a potent chemical. After being combined with porous cubes of plaster, the chemical was sealed in a metal canister and dropped into the barracks in a similar fashion to Zyklon B. SS officers would clear the inmates out of the barracks and then would drop canisters to clear out the infection. Since it would be pointless to clean out a barrack and put infected prisoners back in, the SS would simultaneously force the prisoners to strip down and bathe in harsh chemicals. As humiliating as that was for most prisoners, the Romas in the camps were given a task that was against their beliefs and faith. In their religion, it is against women to allow men other than their husband to see them naked. Therefore, being unclothed in a camp of thousands of men and women was not a mindless act of obedience. Their clothes would then be placed in bags, and this new machine, similar to the microwave, systematically eliminated both the lice and the microorganisms that carried the disease. As the disease spread from prisoner to prisoner, the German officials and Americans after the liberation were constantly in contact with the infected lice and were at a risk for getting it themselves. As Americans were liberating Bergen-Belsen, they posted signs reading, "Dust spread typhus, 5 miles per hour." Going over the speed limit would kick up dust that was infected with lice and could spread typhus faster than it was already going to American soldiers. On the German side, official transcripts of SS Gruppenführer Fritz Katzmann outlined trials of how German personnel were constantly exposed to considerable physical and psychological burdens, such as typhus, and in response, they were constantly vaccinated against typhus. Yet, 120 officers, 18 of whom died, were struck with the disease in one ghetto alone. While this is a sliver of the impression that typhus left on the Holocaust and ultimately European history, this gives a glimpse at the horror of the disease and a picture of the abhorrence of the Nazis. While typhus is almost eradicated currently in society, under 75 years ago, the repercussions of the potent disease were used by Nazis to objectify Jews and other races. Its extreme causticness to the common person living in a ghetto made life scary and difficult. And its invasive nature ruined whole barracks of deprived people in concentration and death camps.